He didn't even look at her when he said it. That was the part that cut deepest. Harold Finch stood in the middle of her store, the store her father built, the store she'd kept alive with her own hands for 6 years, and he pointed at Evelyn Mercer like she was a mule he was thinking about not buying. "I've seen plow horses with more grace," he said, loud enough for the 3 men leaning against the counter to hear. Loud enough that old Mrs. Patterson, shopping for flour near the window, went completely still. "No wonder your daddy left this place to you instead of finding you a husband first. Couldn't have paid a man enough." The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Evelyn's hand was resting flat on the countertop. She didn't move it. She didn't let it shake. If you were standing in her boots right now, what would you do? Before we go any further, if this kind of story speaks to you, the kind about women who were told they were too much, and men who finally understood what too much actually meant, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now. Ring that bell. Drop your city and your country in the comments below because I want to see how far this story travels. And if you stay until the very end, I promise you, you will not regret it. Now let's go back to Dry Creek, Texas, 1877, and the morning everything changed. The trading post smelled like dried tobacco, cedar, and something faintly metallic, like the land itself had been folded up and stored between the shelves. Evelyn Mercer had opened the front doors at 6:30 that morning, same as every morning, and had already hauled 4 grain sacks from the back storeroom before the first customer walked in. She was 28 years old, 5 feet 11 inches in her boots, which she always wore, never hid from, never apologized for. Her shoulders were broad the way a woman's shoulders get broad when she does real work and doesn't have anyone else to do it for her. Her hair was dark brown, pinned up quick and practical, with a strand or two coming loose by mid-morning because she simply didn't have the time or the patience to fuss with it. She wasn't beautiful the way the women in the illustrated magazines were beautiful. She knew that. The town had made sure she knew that. What she was capable. Quietly, stubbornly, extraordinarily capable. She kept the books herself, ordered stock herself, negotiated with suppliers herself, and won, more often than not, because she had a memory like a steel trap, and she could hold a number in her head the way other people held a grudge. The trading post her father, Gerald Mercer, had opened in 1861 had been struggling when he died. By 1874, Evelyn had pulled it out of debt. By 1876, she'd expanded the dry goods section and added a small hardware line that the nearest competitor couldn't match for 60 miles. None of that mattered to Harold Finch. Harold Finch was 44, twice widowed, and owned a modest cattle operation about 8 miles east of town. I was the kind of man who believed that a woman's value could be assessed the way you'd assess a piece of land, quickly, from a distance, and mostly based on how it looked. He'd come in that morning for rope and lamp oil. That was all. But he'd stayed, he'd lingered, because 2 of his friends were already at the counter, and Harold Finch never passed up an audience. He made his comment about the plow horse. He got his laughter. Evelyn reached under the counter, found his receipt, and set it down in front of him without looking up from it. Rope's $2.15, oil's 60 cents. That's $2.75 total. She wrote the figure in her ledger with a steady hand. "You need anything else?" Harold's smile didn't go anywhere. "You know, I heard from Tom Acker that you turned him down last spring. That right?" She kept writing. "And before that, Denny Walsh. He said you near bit his head off when he asked." Harold leaned on the counter, like he owned it. "Women in this county are starting to wonder if you're just plain difficult, Evelyn. Some of the older ones say you got too proud for your own good after your daddy died. Say the work made you hard." She capped her ink pen, looked up at him for the first time. Her eyes were gray, a flat, calm gray, the color of the sky before rain. And she looked at Harold Finch the way you look at an arithmetic problem you've already solved. "Tom Acker wanted a woman to cook and mend and keep quiet," she said. "He told me as much plainly. And Denny Walsh had debts he forgot to mention until the second conversation. I didn't bite anyone's head off. I just paid attention." She slid the receipt toward him. $2.75. One of Harold's friends, a younger fellow named Pete Stroud, who had the decency to look at least slightly uncomfortable, reached for his hat brim. Harold didn't move. "That's the problem right there," Harold said. "You think too much. Man wants a soft place to come home to, not a business partner." He picked up his receipt. "You keep this up. You're going to die alone in this store, Evelyn. surrounded by grain sacks. He left. The bell above the door rang as it always did, light and indifferent, the same sound for Harold Finch walking out as it made for anyone else. Mrs. Patterson, near the flour, pretended to be very interested in the label on a tin of baking powder. Evelyn stood at her counter for a long, still moment. She thought about being angry. Real anger, the kind that burns clean and honest. But anger at Harold Finch felt like getting angry at a rock for being hard. The man was what he was. He wasn't worth the fuel. What stayed with her, what always stayed with her, was the part that sounded true even when it came from the wrong mouth. Die alone in this store. She'd let herself think about that sometimes, in the quiet of Sunday evenings. Not with self-pity, because self-pity was a luxury she couldn't afford and didn't respect, but with a kind of measured honesty that she applied to everything in her life. She looked at the numbers. She assessed the situation. The numbers weren't good. 2 proposals. Both wrong. Not because she was too proud, not because she was difficult, but because she had refused, each time, to pretend to be less than she was for the sake of someone else's comfort. Tom Acker had wanted a woman who would handle the domestic side and ask no questions about the financial side. When Evelyn, naturally, honestly, had asked to see the state of his land deed before any agreement was made, he'd looked at her like she'd sprouted a second head. Denny Walsh had called her impressively mannish during their third conversation and seemed to think it was a compliment. She'd shown them both to the door politely, firmly. The town had turned those 2 departures into a legend. Evelyn Mercer thinks she's too good for a husband. Evelyn Mercer isn't cut from wife cloth. Too sharp, too big, too much. She'd learned not to flinch when she heard it. She'd learned to put her head down and work. Work was honest. Work didn't whisper behind her back. That was how she'd spent 6 years since her father's passing. Working. It was the 3rd week of October when the bell above the door rang again, and she looked up expecting another supply run, another quick transaction, another man who would scan her height with barely concealed surprise and then talk to her like she was probably smarter than she looked. Instead, she got Silas Boone. He came through the door the way men do when they've been outdoors most of their lives and have stopped noticing the difference between inside and outside, with the same easy, unhurried movement, like entering a building was just another part of the landscape. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, built lean the way trail work builds a man, with the kind of tan that went all the way to the collar and stopped cold. Dark hat. Worn but clean coat. The particular look of a man who didn't have much but took care of what he had. He stopped just inside the door, looked around the store with the careful, methodical attention of someone who was actually looking, not just scanning. "Morning," he said. Not to be social, just as a fact. "Morning." Evelyn set down the bolt of fabric she'd been measuring. "What do you need?" He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and smoothed it out on the counter. It was a list, handwritten, but organized, grouped by category. She noticed that immediately. Dry goods together. Hardware separate. Specific quantities written next to each item, not rough guesses. "I'm starting a winter supply run for the McCready operation," he said. "Took on the foreman position last month. They've been ordering from Harlow's down in Mineral Springs, but the delay's been costing them." He tapped the list. "You carry all of this?" She scanned it. "Most of it. The number 2 wire. I have it, but I'd need to order the quantity you're asking. 3 days? Maybe 4. "That works." He nodded once. No performance, no extra words. "What about the lamp oil?" They had 6 barrels on order. "I carry 3 grades. Which are they using?" He didn't hesitate. "The refined. McCready's wife has got sensitivities to the smoke from the cheaper grade." Evelyn looked up from the list. It was a small thing, an almost nothing thing, but she'd been running this store for 6 years, and she'd learned that the men who paid attention to small details, the men who remembered that McCready's wife had sensitivities, who wrote their supply lists in organized columns, were different from the men who didn't. "I've got the refined," she said. "I can do 4 barrels now, 2 on the next run." "Good enough." He straightened up. "You're Evelyn Mercer?" "I am." "Silas Boone." He held out his hand the same way he would have to another man. Straight across. No awkward uncertainty about whether to offer it. Just a handshake. She shook it. Firm, brief, equal. McCready mentioned you run the best organized operation in the county, he said. Said Harlow's always short and always late. Said you're neither. I try not to be. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the territory just adjacent to one. That's a careful way to put it. It's an accurate way. He picked up his list. I'll need to settle the wire order before I finalize the rest of the run. Can I come back Thursday? I'll be here. He nodded again, put his hat back on, turned toward the door, then stopped. He turned back, and she wasn't sure why, because he didn't seem like the kind of man who turned back for no reason. The organizing system you've got back there, he said, nodding toward the storeroom shelves she'd built herself and organized by weight class and frequency of use. Did you design that yourself? She blinked. Nobody had ever asked about the storeroom organizing system in 6 years. Yes, she said. He looked at it for another moment. Smart, he said. Not like a compliment, like an observation, like he was noting that the sky was a particular shade of blue. Then he left. The bell rang. Evelyn stood behind her counter in the particular kind of quiet that follows something you can't quite explain yet. She reached for her ledger, pulled the list of Thursday's expected inventory across the counter. She told herself she was simply doing her job, but she'd already made a note, a small mark at the top of Thursday's page, the way she marked important appointments. Not because of anything she was willing to name yet, just because she paid attention to things that mattered. And for some reason she couldn't immediately account for, something about that interaction felt like it mattered. She wasn't used to that feeling. She'd almost forgotten it had a shape. Outside, Dry Creek went about its business under a sky that was just beginning to think about turning gray for winter. Wagons passed. Dogs crossed the road. A woman in a blue bonnet hurried toward the dry goods end of Main Street with her basket over her arm. Somewhere on the edge of town, a horse stood tied to a post outside the land office. A lean, well-kept chestnut, saddled with quiet practicality. Evelyn didn't see it, but she would have known, if she had, that it didn't belong to anyone who lived in Dry Creek. It belonged to a man who was passing through, who had taken a permanent job here because he was tired of passing through, and who had just walked into a trading post expecting a transaction and come out with something he hadn't listed on his carefully organized supply sheet, something he couldn't have named yet either. He stood outside the land office for a moment after he left the trading post, his list folded in his coat pocket, and he looked back once, just once, at the weathered sign above the trading post door. Mercer's Supply, 1861. He'd heard things about Evelyn Mercer before he walked in. The kind of things that get passed along in bunkhouses and at feed stations, half-idle gossip about a woman who'd run off 2 potential husbands and grown too big for her britches, who was probably lonesome and probably bitter and probably best avoided if you didn't want a sharp tongue cutting you down. He'd walked in with no particular opinion. He walked out with one. She was organized, precise, and completely uninterested in pretending to be otherwise. She hadn't softened herself for him, hadn't smiled extra, hadn't tilted her head and made herself smaller the way some women did when they didn't know what else to do with the man they'd just met. She'd just answered his questions, exactly what he'd asked, exactly what he needed. He thought about that as he untied the chestnut and climbed into the saddle. There was something restful about precision in a person, something quietly remarkable about someone who just was what they were, without the performance of being it. He wasn't a man given to dramatic internal declarations. But as he rode back toward the McCready place, Silas Boone thought, for the first time since he'd come to Dry Creek, that maybe staying in one place for a while wasn't going to be as dull as he'd feared. 3 days later, he came back on Thursday. He came back the Thursday after that. And the Thursday after that. By the 4th Thursday, he'd long since settled the wire order. He came in anyway. Bought a few things he probably could have done without. Stayed longer than a supply run required. Evelyn noticed. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed, because she paid attention to things that mattered. And somewhere between the 1st Thursday and the 4th, against every reasonable calculation she had run in her own head, Silas Boone had started to matter. That terrified her more than Harold Finch ever had, because Harold Finch was just a man saying cruel things about a future she'd already half accepted. But Silas Boone was beginning to look like a future she hadn't let herself believe in. And that was a far more dangerous thing. The 4th Thursday came in cold. Not the bone-deep cold of full winter, but that early November chill that sneaks under your collar and reminds you that the warm months are gone and not coming back for a good long while. Evelyn had lit the small iron stove in the corner of the trading post that morning, and the heat from it didn't quite reach the front of the store, so she'd put on her heavier work apron and kept moving, stacking, counting, writing in her ledger, because movement was the only reliable source of warmth she had. She told herself that was why she kept glancing at the door, because of the cold, because she was restless, because she had an order coming in from the Eastern supplier, and she wanted to get the count right before the wagon arrived, not because of any particular reason tied to any particular person. The bell rang at 9:20. Silas came in the way he always did, without ceremony, without the little social performance most men put on when they entered a room where a woman was standing. No exaggerated tip of the hat, no wide grin, no voice pitched half an octave lower to announce himself. Just the door, and then him, and then he was simply present in the room the way a piece of solid furniture was present, reliably, without drama. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She didn't look up from her ledger immediately. She'd trained herself on that. Looking up immediately felt like something she didn't want to examine too closely. He set a wrapped parcel on the counter. Harness buckle from the Danforth place. They asked if you could source a replacement, said Harlow's quoted them 8 weeks. She looked up then. 8 weeks for a buckle? That's what they said. I can have it in 10 days. She wrote it down. What gauge? He told her. She wrote that too. It was efficient and professional and entirely ordinary, and neither of them acknowledged the fact that the wire order had been settled 2 Thursdays ago, and he didn't strictly need to be here, standing at her counter on a cold November morning, delivering messages for neighbors he'd barely met. He didn't leave after the buckle conversation. He picked up a copy of the agricultural almanac she kept on the corner shelf for customers to browse and flipped through it with the casual air of a man who had nowhere pressing to be, which she happened to know was not true. McCrady's operation was deep in its autumn push, and a foreman in the middle of a seasonal workload did not have loose Thursday mornings to spend in a trading post leafing through almanacs. "There's a coffee pot on the stove," she heard herself say. She wasn't entirely sure why she said it. She had never offered anyone coffee before. She had a cup herself in the mornings, alone, before opening. That was different. That was her own private routine. Offering it to a customer was a different thing entirely. He looked up from the almanac. "You sure?" "The pot's full and I can't finish it myself. It'll go to waste." A perfectly practical reason, an entirely sensible explanation. He set the almanac down and poured himself a cup from the pot on the stove, using the second mug that had been sitting there, clean and unused, on the little shelf beside it. He didn't make a fuss about it, didn't make a comment about the unexpected hospitality, or try to turn it into something social and waited. He just poured the coffee and drank it standing near the stove, where the heat actually reached. "McCrady says you've been running this place since your father passed," he said after a moment. 6 years. By yourself?" "By myself." He nodded like that was information he was filing away, not a thing to be astonished by or congratulated. "You expand the hardware line yourself too?" "Notice that, did you?" "I notice useful things." He glanced toward the back shelves. "Most trading posts this size don't bother with hardware. Too much overhead for a small operation. Most trading posts this size are run by men who have other men to go to when they need something fixed," she said, not bitterly, just factually, the way she said most things. "I don't. So I learned what was needed and I stocked it." Something moved in his expression again. That same almost smile from the first day, that particular quality of attention that felt different from the way most people listened to her. Which was to say, most people didn't listen to her at all. They just waited for a pause in which to say what they'd already decided. "That's a reasonable solution," he said. It worked. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug at the small basin in the back. She noticed that, the rinsing, which no customer had ever bothered with, and set it back on the shelf. "Same time next week," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'll have an update on the Danforth buckle by then." "Good." He picked up his hat. "Thank you for the coffee." He left. Evelyn stood at her counter and looked at the rinsed mug on the shelf for a full 20 seconds before she picked up her pen and went back to her ledger. She wrote 3 incorrect figures in a row before she realized she wasn't concentrating. She crossed them out, careful and precise, and started the column again from the top. By the following Tuesday, 3 separate people had said something to her about Silas Boone. The first was Mabel Cruz, who ran the seamstress shop 2 doors down and who had the particular gift of knowing everyone's business before it became their own. Mabel came in for thread and buttons and mentioned very casually, very offhandedly, that she'd seen the new McCready foreman coming out of Mercer's Supply on Thursday morning, looking like a man who hadn't come in just for supplies. "He's a decent-looking man," Mabel said, holding a spool of thread up to the window light. "He's a customer," Evelyn said. "Of course he is." Mabel set the thread down and picked up another. "Just mentioning." The second was Roy Acker, Tom Acker's younger brother, which made the conversation immediately uncomfortable for reasons Evelyn refused to dwell on, who stopped in for lamp oil and told her, with the cheerful obliviousness of a man who didn't realize he was being unkind, that he'd heard Silas Boone was asking around town about the history of Mercer's Supply. "Asking who?" Evelyn said. "Pete Stroud, few others." Roy shrugged. "Wanted to know how long you'd been running it, how you managed the accounts, that kind of thing. Business curiosity, maybe." He picked up his oil and went to pay. Pete told him about the Walsh business and the Acker business, meaning my brother, not me. "Hope that's all right." It was not all right, but there was nothing she could do about what Pete Stroud said to people in his idle time. So she made change for Roy's oil and wished him a good afternoon, and then stood very still behind her counter for a moment after he left, working through the calculus of what it meant that a man she barely knew had been asking questions about her. The third was Clara Holt, who was 71 years old, had been married to the same man for 48 years before he died, and who had approximately 0 patience for anything she considered nonsense. Clara came in on Wednesday for her regular weekly order: flour, salt, 2 pounds of dried beans, a small amount of tobacco for her pipe, which her late husband had introduced her to and which she'd never given up. She was small and white-haired and moved with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had decided that time was finite and wasting it was a personal failing. She set her basket on the counter and looked at Evelyn directly. "The Boone man," she said. "He's a customer, Clara." "I'm not blind and I'm not stupid." Clara pulled her list from her coat pocket. "He asked me about you." Evelyn's hand stopped moving over the flour scoop. "Asked you what?" "Asked me how long you'd been on your own, whether the business was sound, whether you had family nearby." Clara met her eyes. "I told him the business was the soundest in 3 counties, and your nearest family was a cousin in San Antonio who writes letters twice a year and isn't otherwise useful." He thanked me. "Why would he ask you those things?" "Because I'm old and I look like I know things, which I do." Clara folded her list back up. "He's trying to understand you before he does something about you. That's what decent men do when they're interested. The indecent ones just act." Evelyn put the flour in the basket with more force than was strictly necessary. "He doesn't know me," she said. "He's trying to." "People in this town have been trying to put a story on me for 6 years, Clara. This isn't the same, and you know it." Clara took her basket and looked at Evelyn with the particular patience of a woman who had lived long enough to know when someone was afraid. "You're allowed to let something be different from what hurt you before. That is permitted." She left. Didn't wait for a response. Evelyn swept the countertop that evening with so much energy that she nearly knocked over the inkpot, and she stayed late doing inventory. She could have done the next morning, and she told herself that she was not thinking about any of this. She was extremely unsuccessful at this. Silas came back on Thursday. He didn't bring a supply list. He didn't have a message from a neighbor. He walked in, looked around, and said, "I was in town for the farrier. Thought I'd stop in." Evelyn looked at him. He looked back at her. There was a pause, not uncomfortable exactly, but aware, like 2 people in a room who both know there is a thing neither of them has said yet. "Coffee's gone," she said. "That's fine." He settled against the counter with his arms loosely crossed. "How's the Danforth buckle coming?" "Should be here Monday." "Good." He turned the small display of pocket knives on the countertop 1 slow rotation with a single finger. "Can I ask you something?" She picked up her ledger. Not to look at it, just to have something to hold. "You can ask." "Why'd you turn down the Walsh offer?" Her grip on the ledger tightened fractionally. She kept her voice even. "People have been happy to tell you about that, I take it." "I asked," he said. "There's a difference." "Why does it matter?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for the right thing to say. More the quiet of someone who already knows what they want to say and is deciding whether it's the right time. Because the story I keep hearing doesn't match the woman I keep talking to, and I'd rather know the right version. Something shifted in Evelyn's chest, shifted and tightened and became something she didn't immediately have a name for. Denny Walsh, she said carefully, called me impressively mannish and thought it was a kind thing to say. And before I even got to respond to that, he told me he needed someone to manage the household and keep out of the business side. She set the ledger down. I manage a business. The business side is the only side I know. I wasn't going to apologize for that. No reason you should. The town thought otherwise. The town, Silas said, with a measured calm that wasn't dismissiveness, but something more considered, talks about things it doesn't understand and calls that understanding. She looked at him. You've only been here 2 months. I know what I've seen. And what's that? He unfolded his arms. A woman who runs a better operation than most men twice her age, who gets talked about like a problem that needs solving, and who's decided the safest thing to do is stop expecting anything different. He picked up his hat from the counter. I'm not saying the town's wrong about everything. I'm just saying they're wrong about you. He left before she could answer, which was, she would later admit only to herself, probably the right call on his part, because she didn't have an answer ready. She had approximately 15 years of practiced self-containment and a carefully constructed wall, and Silas Boone had just walked up to that wall and knocked on it like someone who fully expected it to have a door. She stood there after he left, the bell still ringing, fading, gone, and she pressed one hand flat against the counter and breathed. The next Sunday, she went to town for her one standing social obligation of the week, which was the small informal gathering at Clara Holt's house that a handful of women attended to drink tea and talk about whatever was actually happening in their lives, as opposed to what they presented to the rest of Dry Creek. There were 5 of them that week: Clara, Mabel Cruz, a quiet woman named Rose Danforth, whose husband owned the farm with the buckle problem, a schoolteacher named Judith Warren, and Evelyn. She'd been coming to these Sundays for 4 years. They were the one place she didn't feel the weight of the town's assessment of her. In Clara's front room, on Clara's mismatched chairs, she was just Evelyn. Not Evelyn who couldn't keep a man. Not Evelyn who was too much. She hadn't planned to say anything about Silas. Mabel brought him up within 7 minutes of the tea being poured. He was at the farrier on Thursday, Mabel said. And then he went to the trading post. I saw him come out. She looked at Evelyn with the pleasant innocence of a woman who is absolutely being intentional. Anything to report? He's a customer, Evelyn said, for what felt like the 47th time that week. He asked my Henry whether the trading post was doing well financially, Rose Danforth said quietly, holding her teacup with both hands. Henry said yes, of course. Everyone knows Evelyn runs the tightest books in the county. She paused. Henry thought it was an odd question for a man just passing through. He's not passing through, Clara said, definitively, like she was settling a matter of fact. He took a permanent position. He's staying. Evelyn studied her tea. Judith Warren, who was 34 and had the particular perception of a woman who spent her days watching children figure out which lies they could get away with, leaned forward slightly. Evelyn, does he make you nervous? Nothing makes me nervous. That's not an answer. Evelyn set down her cup, looked at the 5 women around her, women who knew her, who had witnessed the Walsh business and the Acker business, and every piece of quiet heartbreak she'd swallowed in the years since her father died and left her alone in a world that didn't quite know what to do with her. He talks to me, she said, not at me, not around me. He actually talks to me like I'm a person worth talking to, and that's... She stopped. That's what? Clara said. That's harder to handle than the alternative. She picked up her cup again. Being dismissed is something I know how to manage. I've had 6 years of practice. This is something else. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Clara, with the quiet precision of a woman who had been married for 48 years and understood things about human hearts that most people only read about, said, That's because this is the real thing beginning, and the real thing is always harder than nothing. The week that followed was one of the stranger ones in Evelyn's memory, because things started happening that she hadn't prepared for. Harold Finch came in on Monday. Not for supplies. He had a boy who usually ran those. He came himself, and he stood at the counter and he said, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once reconsidered a statement he'd made, I hear the McCready foreman's been spending time in here. He's a customer. Hmm. Harold leaned on the counter. Word of advice, Evelyn, and I say it with good intentions. Don't read too much into a man being polite. Some men are polite to everyone, doesn't mean anything. She looked at him for a long moment. Harold, she said, I have 17 things to do before noon. Was there something you needed to buy? He bought nothing. He left. But the thing he'd said stayed with her in the way that things stay when they land near an existing wound. She knew, rationally, clearly, that Harold Finch's opinions were worth approximately nothing. She knew that. But he touched a nerve that was already raw. Because the truth was, she didn't know what Silas Boone's visits meant. She didn't know if they meant anything beyond what they appeared to be. A man who found her store convenient and her company reasonably tolerable. She was 34 years old, and she had exactly zero reliable experience interpreting the signals of a man who was treating her like a full human being, because that had happened so rarely in her life that she had no reference points. She was, for the first time she could remember, genuinely uncertain. And uncertainty, for Evelyn Mercer, was the most uncomfortable place in the world. It was 2 days later, a Wednesday, when she was hauling the new hardware delivery from the back to the front shelves, that Pete Stroud came in with 2 other men she recognized vaguely from the cattle operations east of town. She heard them before she saw them, their voices carrying the loose, careless sound of men who have been riding together and have run out of their own conversation. Tell you, it's the strangest thing. Man's bright enough, does good work, but every Thursday, like a clock, he's in here talking to the Mercer woman. This was Pete's voice. Asked her about her storeroom shelves, if you believe it. Laughter from one of the others. What's he see in that? The laughing one said. Woman's near as tall as he is. Got no softness to her at all. Some men like a project, Pete said. Evelyn heard all of it from behind a shelf of boxed hardware. She stood very still, a metal hand brace in each hand, and she made a decision. The decision she had always made, which was to hear the thing and not let it find the soft places, not let it do what it was trying to do. She came around the shelf with both hand braces and set them on the front counter. All 3 men went quiet. Pete, she said, you need something? Pete's face did a complicated thing. He'd heard the steel in her voice even though she hadn't put any particular effort into putting it there. Just, yeah, leather cord, 2 yards. She cut it, wrapped it, charged him fair, didn't say another word. They left quickly. She stood at the counter and she pressed her fingers against the wood, and she felt, not anger this time, not exactly, something older than anger, something that had been building for a long time and didn't have a clean name. She was so tired. Not of the work, never of the work, but of the cost of being seen the way they saw her, of having to be armored every single day in a town that treated her like a challenge to be assessed rather than a person to be known. She was tired in a way that had nothing to do with hauling grain sacks. She was still at the counter, still pressing her fingers against the wood, when the bell rang. She looked up. Silas stood in the doorway. He saw her face, whatever was in her face right then, which she hadn't had time to put away. And he didn't do the thing that most people did, which was to either look away politely or ask her what was wrong in that overly bright, intrusive way that wasn't actually concern. He came in, walked to the counter, stood across from her. Pete Stroud's out front, he said, looking like he swallowed something bad. He was in here a few minutes ago. Silas waited. Evelyn looked at him. Then she looked past him at the middle distance and said, without planning to say it, I am exhausted by this town's opinion of me. It came out flat. Not dramatic. Not a bid for sympathy. Just a statement of fact, like a number in a ledger. True. Exact. I know, Silas said. You don't know, she said. You've been here 2 months. I know what I've heard. And I know what I see when I walk in here, which is a woman who runs this place better than it has any right to be run, and who has to be 10 times as capable as anyone around her just to get halfway the same consideration. He put both hands on the counter and leaned forward slightly. That's not a compliment, that's an observation. It's a lousy situation, and it's not fair. She looked at him directly. The problem, he said, quieter now, is not you. I want to make sure you understand that clearly. The problem has never been you. The store was very quiet. Outside, the November wind moved down the street and made the store's hanging sign creak on its chain. People keep saying things like that, she said carefully, and then finding reasons to stop saying them. I know. He didn't look away. I'm not asking you to trust me because I said the right thing once. That'd be a fool's bargain. He straightened up. I'm asking you to let me keep saying it until it stops sounding like something you're waiting for me to take back. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. There was a sound outside, a wagon going past, a man calling to someone across the street, the ordinary percussion of Dry Creek going about its afternoon. The fire in the iron stove ticked and settled. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. What she said was, "The Danforth buckle came in. I'll have it wrapped for you to pick up Thursday." But she said it differently than she would have said it a month ago. And Silas Boone, who was the kind of man who paid attention to things that mattered, heard exactly what was underneath it. He put his hat on. "Thursday," he said. The bell rang. He was gone. And Evelyn Mercer stood in her store in the particular quality of silence that follows a conversation that has changed something, and she allowed herself, just for a moment, just for one careful private moment, to feel something she had not felt in a very long time. Not certainty. Not hope. Exactly. Just the faint, fragile, terrifying possibility of it. She picked up her pen. She went back to work. But her handwriting, usually so precise and even, came out slightly larger that afternoon, fuller, like something inside her was taking up more space than it had yesterday. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did and chose not to examine it. Either way, the ledger sat on the counter at the end of that day with slightly larger letters than usual, and the fire in the iron stove had burned down to coals, and the wind outside had picked up, and Thursday was 6 days away. She locked the store at dusk. She walked home on the same road she'd walked every evening for 6 years, past the same buildings, under the same sky going dark. But something was different, and she didn't fight it. She just walked and let the possibility come with her, and didn't try to reason it away before it had the chance to become anything real. That was the bravest thing Evelyn Mercer had done in a long time, and it was only the beginning. Thursday came and went, and then another Thursday, and somewhere in the turning of those weeks, the visits stopped being something Evelyn explained to herself and started being something she simply waited for. That was the change she noticed first, not the waiting itself. She'd always been a woman who planned her days with precision, who knew exactly what was coming and when. But this was different from planning. This was the particular quality of attention that lives in the body before the mind admits what it's doing. The way she'd glance at the clock at 9:15 on Thursday mornings. The way she'd already rinsed the second mug before he arrived, even though she always told herself she was just cleaning up. She didn't examine it too closely. Examining things closely had become, somewhere in the last month, a less reliable comfort than it used to be. Silas, for his part, kept showing up. He didn't escalate. He didn't push. He came in on Thursdays and sometimes on other days when he had an actual reason, and he talked to her the way he always had, directly, without performance, with that particular quality of attention that she had initially distrusted and was now, slowly and against her better judgment, beginning to depend on. He asked her opinion on things, not politely, not to fill silence, but because he actually wanted to know. He asked about the county's supply routes, which she knew better than anyone within 40 miles. He asked about the McCready land's soil quality, because she'd been trading with farming families for 6 years, and had absorbed things about the land the way you absorb things you're surrounded by daily. He asked about the families he was slowly coming to know, and she gave him honest, careful assessments, and he listened to all of it and used the information and then came back and told her whether she'd been right. She had been right, mostly. He told her so plainly. She stored that away in a private place she didn't examine out loud. It was the second week of November when he came in on a Tuesday, not a Thursday, a Tuesday. And he wasn't carrying anything, and he wasn't looking for supplies, and he didn't pretend otherwise. "There's a stretch of the river trail I want to walk before the cold settles in hard," he said, "north of the McCready fence. The view's supposed to be something from up there." He looked at her evenly. "I wondered if you'd come." Evelyn's hands were on the counter. She was aware, with the precision that defined most of her inner life, that this was a different kind of question from anything he had asked her before. The supply runs, the coffee, the conversations, those had lived inside the trading post, inside the space of commerce and routine that she controlled. This was outside. This was something else. It's a Tuesday, she said. Not a refusal, just a fact. The store closes at 4, he said. The light holds until near 5:30 this time of year. It's an hour's walk, maybe less. He knew her hours. She hadn't told him her hours directly. She noticed that. I haven't walked that trail in years, she said. I haven't walked it at all. I'd want someone who knows the land. That was practical. That was a reasonable justification. She could accept a reasonable justification. I'll close at 4, she said. He nodded. I'll be out front. He was. She came out at 2 minutes past 4. She'd been deliberately slow locking the back storeroom, which she acknowledged to herself and was irritated by. And he was leaning against the post outside with his hat in his hand, looking up the street with the patient, unhurried expression of a man who wasn't keeping track of time. They walked. The trail north of town ran alongside the creek for the first quarter-mile, and then climbed a low ridge through scrub oak and dry grass that rustled in the November wind. Evelyn knew the path well enough. She'd walked it in her 20s, before the store consumed all her hours, before walking somewhere for no practical purpose started to feel like a luxury she couldn't justify. She'd forgotten how it looked from up here. The ridge gave you the whole spread of the valley, the creek winding through the brown grass, the rooftops of Dry Creek just visible to the south, and beyond that the open plains stretching out toward the horizon in every direction, enormous and indifferent and quietly beautiful. There it is, Silas said. Yes. They stood at the overlook for a moment in companionable quiet. Not the uncomfortable quiet of two people who don't know what to say. The other kind, the kind that means you're comfortable enough not to need to fill it. I grew up in Missouri, he said eventually, not like he was starting a story, but like he was just saying a thing out loud. Flat country mostly. Good farmland, bad soil in places. I left when I was 19. Why? My father needed the farm to go to my oldest brother. That was just how it was. I wasn't bitter about it. He looked out at the valley. I thought I'd find my own place. Took me longer than I thought. How long? 15 years of longer. She looked at the side of his face, the particular quality of stillness there, the lack of self-pity in it. He wasn't asking for anything with the information. He was just giving it. You've been a foreman that whole time? She asked. Different places. Montana for 4 years, Kansas 3. 2 different outfits in Colorado. He paused. I'm good at the work. I understand land and animals and how to manage a large operation. But a foreman works someone else's land. At the end of 15 years, I still didn't have a home. And now? He turned and looked at her. I'm trying to find out. The wind moved through the dry grass below the ridge and made a sound like something breathing. Evelyn looked back at the valley. She thought about 15 years of moving. She thought about 6 years of standing still in the same building, and how those 2 different forms of loneliness were probably more similar than they appeared. I almost sold the store, she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it. 3 years ago. After the second winter where I ran a loss. I had an offer from a supply company out of Fort Worth, so fair offer, not generous. I had a letter written accepting it. What stopped you? I threw the letter in the stove, she paused, because I couldn't think of anything I would do instead. The store was the only thing I knew how to be. A beat. That's not a good reason to keep a business, but it was the reason I had. Did the business turn around? I renegotiated 3 supplier contracts the following spring and expanded the hardware line, so yes. That sounds like a good reason in retrospect. It does now. She turned the collar of her coat up against the wind. At the time, it felt like stubbornness. Sometimes stubbornness and good judgment look identical until you can tell them apart from the far end. She almost smiled. Almost. They walked back down the ridge in the failing light, the creek beside them running quieter as the temperature dropped, and somewhere near the edge of town where the path met the road again, Silas stopped and she stopped with him. I want to say something, he said, and I want to say it clearly because I think you deserve clear things. She waited. I don't come to your store because of supplies. I come because of you. He looked at her directly. That same unhurried, level regard, the same lack of performance. I'm not trying to make you into anything or fix anything about you. I just want to know you, more than I do already. A pause. I thought you should know that plainly. Evelyn looked at him. She thought about Harold Finch and his comment about the plow horses. She thought about Denny Walsh and the word mannish delivered like a compliment. She thought about Tom Acker and the careful list of duties he'd wanted her to perform. She thought about 6 years of people who saw her as a problem to be solved or a lesson to be pointed to. She thought about what Clara Holt had said. This is the real thing beginning. I appreciate playing, she said finally. I know you do. They stood on the road at the edge of town in the early dark of November, and the lamplights were coming on in the windows along Main Street, and somewhere a horse stamped and blew in the cold, and neither of them moved for a long moment. Thursday, she said. It wasn't a goodbye, it was a yes. He heard it the way she intended it. Thursday, he said. He walked in the direction of the livery, where his horse was stabled. She walked toward the trading post, which was dark and locked, and hers. And she did not allow herself to look back, and she walked the whole way home with the particular careful composure of a woman who is holding something fragile and knows it. Inside, alone, she sat down at the kitchen table in her small house behind the store, and she put both hands flat on the table and she breathed. She was terrified, not of him, not exactly, of the thing she was beginning to want, because wanting something meant it could be taken away, and Evelyn had gotten very good at wanting nothing specific enough to be taken away. This was already too specific, and she couldn't make herself stop. She got up and made tea, she didn't drink, and went to bed and stared at the ceiling for 2 hours and told herself nothing comforting, because she had never been a woman who told herself comfortable lies, and she wasn't going to start now. She fell asleep eventually, with her hands curled at her sides. By morning, she had not resolved anything. But she had come, in that particular way that things come clear in the early hours of a cold morning, to one honest and uncomfortable conclusion. She did not want to talk herself out of this. That alone was extraordinary. The town, predictably, noticed before Evelyn was prepared for it. She had forgotten, or perhaps she had suppressed, how thoroughly a small town watches its own. How a Tuesday afternoon walk and a particular quality of attention from a man who wasn't from here would circulate through Dry Creek the way water circulates through a closed system. By Thursday morning, 3 people had already made remarks. Not cruel remarks necessarily, just the low hum of collective notice, of the town's antenna turning in a new direction. Mabel Cruz stopped in for more thread. She went through thread at a rate that Evelyn had always suspected was pretextual, and said, with barely concealed delight, that she'd heard Silas Boone and Evelyn Mercer had been seen walking the ridge trail on Tuesday evening. It was a practical walk, Evelyn said. Mabel's expression communicated, silently but with great eloquence, that she did not believe this. More troubling was Harold Finch. He came in on Wednesday with 2 of his regular companions, and he stood at the counter with the look of a man who has been talking about something for a while and has now arrived at the primary audience he wanted. Here you've taken up with the McCready foreman, he said. I have customers I talk to, Evelyn said. She was measuring out salt for an order, and she kept measuring. Word is it's more than talking. Harold leaned on the counter. His companions arranged themselves behind him with the loose, satisfied posture of an audience that knows entertainment is coming. I got no stake in it personally, but I'd say it as a matter of concern. A man new to town, no property, no family here, spending time with a woman who runs a property worth something. You want to be careful what you're signing up for. Evelyn set down the scoop. She looked at Harold. In the past, in the 6 years of the past that stretched behind her like a long gray road, she would have answered him with composure and efficient dismissal. She would have made her meaning clear in the fewest possible words and sent him on his way and stood there afterward absorbing the cost of it alone. But something had shifted in her since Tuesday evening on the ridge. Something small and structural, like a single stone moved from one place to another, that changes the whole balance of a wall. Harold, she said, you came in here last month with no purpose except to tell me I'd die alone surrounded by grain sacks. Now you're coming in to warn me about the dangers of company. I'd appreciate it if you'd decide which outcome you're rooting for, and pick one, because I have a lot of orders to fill and limited time for things that aren't my business. One of Harold's companions made a sound that was almost a laugh, and converted itself poorly into a cough. Harold's expression did several things in rapid succession. Just looking out for you, he said, finally, with considerably less confidence than he'd walked in with. Buy something or don't, Evelyn said, but I'm busy. He bought nothing. He left. The companion who'd almost laughed gave her a brief, slightly abashed look of respect on his way out. She went back to measuring salt. Her hands were perfectly steady. But inside was a different matter. Inside she was shaking, not with fear but with something else, something she didn't have a clean word for. Something like the feeling when you've been bracing against a door for years and you finally stop bracing and discover the door wasn't going to fall in after all. Something like the first easy breath after a long, unnecessary holding. She had talked back to Harold Finch, not wittily, not dramatically, just honestly and with the full weight of someone who has decided not to apologize for what she is and what she wants. She stood at her counter and thought, Clara's going to hear about this and be insufferably pleased. Clara was. She stopped in on Friday, already knowing, wearing the particular expression of a woman enjoying the exact outcome she'd predicted. I heard you sorted out Harold Finch, she said. I was direct with him. People are saying you were magnificent. I was tired and I had salt to measure. Clara sat down on the stool Evelyn kept behind the counter. The stool nobody else was offered, but Clara had stopped asking permission for things decades ago. He's coming to dinner on Saturday. Silas. Evelyn looked up sharply. He's coming to your dinner? I invited him. Clara folded her hands in her lap with the serenity of a woman who sees no problem whatsoever. He's been in town 2 months, and the only person who's actually talked to him properly is you. That's not a welcome. I'm correcting that. Clara, he said yes. You should come. You always come to my dinners. There are other people at your dinners. Yes, and none of them are you or Silas Boone, so the fact that both of you will be there is entirely incidental. She stood up with brisk finality. Saturday, 6 o'clock. Bring the dried apple preserves you make, because mine always turn out too tart. She left before Evelyn could construct a sufficient argument. Saturday's dinner at Clara Holt's house was a small thing. 6 people around a table that was slightly too small for 6 people, so that everyone was shoulder close and the conversation couldn't be avoided by looking elsewhere. Clara had arranged the seating with what she doubtless considered subtle craft. Evelyn was placed across from Silas, which meant she couldn't not look at him without it being conspicuous. He looked different in Clara's front room. Not dressed up exactly. He didn't have the air of a man who owned formal clothes, and that was fine. But he was clean and neat and easy in the social situation in a way she hadn't seen him before, outside the trading post. He talked to Clara without stiffness. He asked the other man at the table, a local farmer named Edwin Gaines, about the soil conditions on the north side of the county, and genuinely listened to the answer. Evelyn watched him from across the table and felt something settle in her chest. A recognition. This was not a man performing acceptable behavior for an audience. This was just who he was. That was somehow the most unsettling thing she'd observed about him yet. After dinner, when Clara had been persuaded to sit down, and Edwin Gaines had started a slow conversational story that showed no signs of concluding, Silas found a moment in the general shuffle to be near Evelyn without it being the center of attention. "How'd you do with Harold Finch this week?" he asked, low enough that only she heard. She looked at him sideways. "How do you know about that?" "Small town." The near smile. "I heard you handled it well." "I was rude to a customer." "You were honest to someone who deserved honesty." He glanced across the room. "He's been making remarks about you in the feed store. I heard 2 of them." She stilled. "What kind of remarks?" "The kind that say more about the person making them than the person they're about." His voice was even, but there was something underneath it. "I didn't respond because I thought you'd rather handle your own situation, but I want you to know I'm not indifferent to it." She looked at him directly. "What would you have said if you'd responded?" "I'd have told him that a woman who's run a successful supply operation for 6 years without any assistance, who kept her father's business from failing, who negotiates better than most men I've worked with, that woman doesn't need his assessment or his concern. And his opinions say a lot more about what he's threatened by than about what she lacks." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "You could have just said that," she said. "I just did." Clara, from across the room, was very carefully not watching them, which meant she was watching them with extraordinary attention. Winter came in fast the following week, the real cold, the kind that put ice on the water trough overnight and made the morning air bite. Evelyn added a second layer of wood to the stove, and her breath showed in the store until nearly 10 o'clock each day, when the building finally held enough heat. Silas came in on Thursday with his collar up and moved directly to the warmth of the stove, the way he always did now, with the ease of someone who has been given permission to be comfortable in a space. She'd never formally given that permission. It had just accumulated, the way trust accumulates, without ceremony. "I want to show you something," he said. "Saturday morning, if you can spare it." "Show me what?" "Something at the McCready place. It'll take most of the morning." She considered. "I can get Charlie Wren to open up for me. He's done it before." "Good." He was warming his hands at the stove. "Dress warm." "Silas." She was folding a piece of canvas on the counter. "What is it?" He looked at her over the stove, and this time the almost smile was fully a smile, brief, genuine, with something underneath it that looked like anticipation. "I don't want to say before you see it. Just trust me for one morning." She went still. "Trust me." 2 words that should have been simple. 2 words that Evelyn had spent years refusing to let apply to anything outside of her own capabilities and her own judgment. She looked at him across the stove and she thought about Tuesday on the ridge. She thought about the rinsed coffee mug. She thought about 15 years of moving and the man who finally stopped moving 2 months ago in Dry Creek, Texas. "All right," she said. Saturday morning was clear and bitterly cold, the sky a hard, bright blue that meant no weather, but also no warmth. Silas met her at the edge of the McCready property at 8:30, and he walked her around the main barn to a paddock on the south side where she had never been. There was a horse in the paddock, a gray mare. Big, genuinely big, not the slim quarter-horse build of most working animals around Dry Creek, but deep-chested and long-legged, with the kind of bone structure that suggested she could carry real weight with real power. She stood near the far fence with her head up, watching them approach with alert dark eyes, neither nervous nor indifferent. Curious, maybe. The way certain animals are curious. Intelligently, specifically. Evelyn stopped at the paddock fence. She felt something move in her chest that she didn't immediately understand. "She came in from a breeder in New Mexico," Silas said, standing beside her at the fence. "McCready bought her for trail work, but she's not right for the ranch use he had in mind. He was going to sell her." He paused. "I asked him to hold off." The mare tossed her head once and walked a few steps closer, then stopped, regarding them. Evelyn didn't speak. There was a thing that had happened, years ago. She had not spoken of it to anyone in Dry Creek. She had not spoken of it to Clara, which was remarkable because she spoke to Clara about most things. She had buried it in the practical years that followed, and she had not looked at it directly, because there were things you learned, when you lived as she lived, not to look at directly. When she was 22, she had gone to the Darrow stable on the south end of Main Street to rent a horse for a practical errand. She needed to get to the Kessler farm, 6 miles out, to confirm a supply order that was too large to lose if it went wrong. The horse she was assigned was a standard working bay. Evelyn had put her foot in the stirrup and swung up into the saddle. The bay had refused her, not violently, not bucking, not rearing, just planted, refusing to move with her weight, sidestepping and circling back. The stable hand had come out and watched and then said, with the clinical disinterest of someone stating an obvious fact, that the horse wasn't used to carrying that much. He'd gone back inside to get a larger animal, and 2 other customers who'd been waiting had watched the whole thing, and one of them had made a remark she couldn't hear but could interpret clearly from the angle of his face. She'd taken the larger horse. She'd made the errand. She'd done what needed doing. She'd never ridden again. Not because one horse refused her, not because of the remark she couldn't hear, but because the accumulation of everything, the too tall, the too much, the too different, had built to a particular weight that day, and riding was something she associated now with that weight, and she had simply stopped. She had told herself it wasn't practical anyway. She didn't need a horse. The supply routes were manageable by wagon. It was a reasonable decision. She had believed it. Standing at the McCready paddock fence, looking at the gray mare, something in the sealed compartment where she'd put that story started to leak. "Silas," she said. Her voice came out slightly different than she intended. "I know about the stable," he said, quietly, not gently, not the sentimental gentleness of someone being careful with damaged goods, just plainly, the way he said everything. She looked at him. "Clara? Clara?" She would have felt irritated about that if she had any room left for irritation, but the gray mare had walked another few steps closer and was now close enough that Evelyn could see the individual hairs of her winter coat, the warm, dark intelligence of her eyes. She's built for someone your size, Silas through the shoulder, deep in the barrel. She's not too much horse for most riders, but she's enough horse for someone who needs the right match. He glanced at Evelyn. I'm not saying you need to ride her. I'm saying the reason you stopped had nothing to do with you or with riding. Evelyn put her hand on the top fence rail. I know what you're doing, she said. What am I doing? You're trying to give something back to me. I'm trying to correct a wrong story, he said. The story that says you're too much, that says you don't fit. That's a wrong story, and I've got one morning and a gray mare, and I'd like to try to say so clearly. The wind moved across the paddock. The mare stretched her nose toward Evelyn's hand on the fence rail. She let it. Evelyn held still and let the horse smell her hand, and the mare's breath was warm even in the cold air. And Evelyn stood at the fence with her heart in her throat and her face completely composed and something ancient and complicated moving through her that had the particular texture of grief and the particular shape of something being released. All right, she said. The second time she'd said those two words to him, both times terrifying. Both times she was beginning to understand. Right. He opened the paddock gate. She walked in. The mare watched her come with that steady, curious attention, and Evelyn walked slowly, not performing calm, but actually finding it, the way you find things sometimes in the body before the mind catches up. She put her hand on the mare's neck, felt the muscle under the winter coat, the warmth of her, the absolute enormous alive realness of her. The saddle was already on. She hadn't noticed that before. You were confident I'd say yes, she said. I was hopeful, he said. There's a difference. She looked at the saddle. She looked at the stirrup, which Silas had already adjusted, had thought to adjust ahead of time, to the right length for her height. Her heart was hitting hard. She thought about the stable hand's clinical voice, the angle of that stranger's face, 6 years of being the woman who didn't ride, who managed without it, who didn't need things she'd told herself she didn't want. She put her foot in the stirrup. She swung up. The mare stood perfectly still under her. Didn't flinch, didn't sway, didn't take a single shuffling step of adjustment. She simply held, solid and sure, like something built for exactly this. Evelyn sat in the saddle. She was breathing, carefully, each breath deliberate. Silas stood at the paddock fence with his hands in his coat pockets, not telling her what to do, not instructing, just watching, with the same quality of attention he'd given her since the first Thursday, like she was someone worth watching, someone worth seeing. The mare shifted her weight under her, once, settling in. Evelyn picked up the reins. She pressed her heels gently. The mare moved forward, smooth, willing, entirely unbothered. They walked the length of the paddock, turned, walked back. Evelyn sat up straight, the way she had always been told not to, the way her height had always been pointed to as a problem, and in the saddle on the gray mare she was tall and straight and exactly right, and there was no one here to say otherwise. Her eyes were burning. She wasn't going to cry. She was absolutely not going to cry. She was 34 years old, and she was riding a horse in a paddock in the cold November air, and she was not going to cry about it. Her eyes were burning anyway. She rode the length of the paddock twice more, and then she turned the mare toward the fence where Silas was standing, and she stopped. And she sat there for a moment looking out past the fence at the cold, bright fields and the distant hills and the enormous, indifferent sky. Silas, she said. Yeah. I want to go up to the ridge. She felt, rather than saw, the thing that moved across his face. Give me 5 minutes to saddle the chestnut, he said. They rode out together on the frost-hardened ground, the gray mare and the lean chestnut, out past the McCready fence and up toward the low ridge she'd walked with him 2 weeks ago. The cold was sharp, and the light was hard and clean, and the sky above was so blue it was almost violent. At the overlook, they stopped. Below them, the valley, the creek, the rooftops of Dry Creek, the enormous plains beyond. From on horseback, it was different, higher, more. She sat on the gray mare at the top of the ridge, and she looked at the world that had spent 6 years trying to make her feel like she was too much of herself to be enough for it. And she felt, clearly, solidly, without drama or performance, that the world was wrong. She had always known it, but knowing something and feeling it in your body from the back of a horse on a clear November morning are different registers of truth. You said you've been looking for a home, she said. I have. She kept her eyes on the valley below. You said you'd been looking for someone strong enough to stand beside you. He was quiet. I'm not an easy person, she said. I have opinions about everything, and I'll tell you when I think you're wrong, and I run my own business, and I will never be the soft place people think a man is supposed to come home to. I know. I'm telling you clearly, she said, before anything, so it's said plainly. Evelyn. He moved the chestnut a step closer, so they were side by side at the overlook, shoulder close, the way they'd been at Clara's dinner table. I know who you are. I've been paying attention since the first Thursday. He looked at her, directly, without the slightly sideways quality most people used when they looked at her, like she was too much to look at straight on. I don't want the soft place. I want this, exactly this. The mare stood still beneath her. The wind moved through the dry grass on the ridge. Evelyn looked at Silas Boone in the hard, clear light of a Texas November morning, and she felt something she had been afraid of for a very long time, and she did not run from it, and she did not talk herself out of it, and she did not reach for the practical ledger she kept in her mind where she put difficult emotions. She just felt it. All right, she said, the third time. And this time when she said it, something in his face changed, not dramatically, not with proclamation, just the way a landscape changes when the light shifts. A small and permanent alteration. They sat on horseback at the top of the ridge for a long time that morning, talking and not talking, looking at the valley and looking at each other and letting the thing that had been building between them since the first careful Thursday take up the space it had earned. It wasn't smooth. She asked him twice to repeat things because the wind carried his words away, and once the gray mare decided to be interested in something in the grass to the left, and Evelyn had to correct her, and her correction was slightly too firm, and she muttered something about still figuring out the horse's mouth. And Silas didn't laugh, but his shoulders moved in a way that told her he wanted to. It was cold and imperfect and real. It was the most real thing that had happened to Evelyn Mercer in years. They rode back down the ridge in the late morning with the frost already melting off the grass in the places where the sun reached. And when they reached the McCready gate, Silas held it open for her to pass through, and she did. And when she dismounted in the paddock, she wasn't entirely graceful about it and didn't try to be. She gave the mare a long stroke down the neck. She needs a name, Silas said. Evelyn looked at the mare, the steady dark eyes, the solid, uncomplicated willingness of her. Her name's her own, Evelyn said. I'll know it when I know it. He accepted that with a nod. She walked back to town. She opened the store at noon instead of 9, and Charlie Wren, who had covered the morning, looked at her slightly pink cheeks and her loosened hair and said nothing, which meant he noticed everything. She went behind the counter, got out the ledger. Her handwriting was large again, fuller than practical. She noticed it this time, and this time she didn't wonder about it. She knew exactly what it was. The mayor's name came to her on a Wednesday. She was behind the counter finishing the weekly accounts when it arrived. Not like a decision, but like a fact she'd always known and only just remembered. She set down her pen and said it quietly to herself in the empty store, just to hear how it landed. Flint. Because the mare was gray and solid and struck something out of you when you made contact with her. Because she was not soft and did not pretend to be, and there was nothing wrong with that. She wrote it in the margin of the ledger page, small, neat, certain. Then she went back to the accounts. She told Silas on Thursday. I was at the stove with his coffee. It was his mug now, in the sense that it was always the same mug, and she always had it clean and ready, which was a fact neither of them had commented on. And he turned the name over for a moment. Flint, he said. Yes. He nodded once the way he nodded when something was right. It suits her. I thought so. They stood in the warm store with the cold pressing at the windows and the smell of wood smoke and dried goods around them. And it was so ordinary, so quietly, steadily ordinary, that Evelyn had to stop herself from thinking about it too hard, because thinking about it too hard was how she'd spent the better part of her adult life talking herself out of things. This was different from the Thursdays before the ridge. There was something between them now that had been named without being spoken aloud. A direction, a current, a leaning toward that both of them recognized and neither of them rushed. She appreciated that about him more than she could have articulated, that he moved at the same pace she needed. Not because he was passive, but because he understood that some things needed time to become real, and pushing didn't help. He came to the store on Tuesdays now, as well as Thursdays, sometimes on Saturdays if the McCready work allowed. He always had a reason, a supply run, a message, a piece of equipment to pick up. And the reasons were usually genuine, which she appreciated because she would have noticed if they weren't. But the reasons had become secondary. They both knew that. Clara noticed, of course. Clara noticed everything. She made no comment for 2 weeks, which was its own kind of comment, and then on the first Sunday of December she sat in her good chair in her front room with her tea and looked at Evelyn with the patient expression of a woman waiting for an accounting. "Well," Clara said. "Well, what?" "Don't waste my time, Evelyn." Evelyn held her own tea with both hands. The fire was going in Clara's hearth, and the room was warm and full of the particular smell of Clara's house, wood smoke and dried lavender, and something baked earlier in the day. "We've been spending time together. We talk. We understand each other. And nothing else yet. We're being careful." Clara tilted her head slightly. "Are you being careful or are you being afraid?" Evelyn looked at the fire. "Both, probably. I can't always tell them apart." "That's honest." Clara took a sip of tea. "What does he say?" "He says he's not in a hurry, that he spent 15 years making fast decisions about where to be, and he'd rather take the time on this one." "And you believe him?" It wasn't a question exactly, more like a door left open. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I believe him." Clara set her cup down with a small, decisive click. "Good. Then stop analyzing it to pieces and let it be what it is." Easy to say. Harder to do when the entire architecture of your inner life had been built on the premise that careful examination was the only reliable protection you had. But she was trying. The first real test of that trying came from a direction she hadn't expected. It was a Thursday in mid-December, and Silas had been in the store for 20 minutes, and they'd moved from the supply conversation into the kind of talk that had no particular subject, the kind that circles around two people's actual lives without requiring a stated purpose. He'd been telling her about a problem with one of the McCready fences, a section of the North Line that kept failing because the posts had been set too shallow years ago. And she'd been listening with one part of her attention while restocking a shelf of patent medicines with the other. The bell rang. She looked up. It was Tom Acker. Not Roy. Tom. The elder. The one who'd proposed to her 4 years ago with his mental list of domestic requirements and his look of bewilderment when she'd asked to see the land deed. He stopped just inside the door and saw Silas at the counter, and his expression did something that was too quick to fully track, but she caught enough of it. A kind of recalculation, a narrowing. "Evelyn," he said. He didn't look at Silas again. "Need a word." "I'm with a customer," she said. Even. "It won't take long." He came to the counter anyway, which forced Silas to shift slightly to the side or make a point of not shifting, and he chose, with the particular tact of a man who understood situations, to shift. Slightly. "I heard you've been spending time with the McCready foreman." "Tom." Her voice was patient with effort. "Whatever you've heard, I don't think it's your concern." Tom Acker was 41, broad-shouldered, not an unkind man in most respects, but the particular set of his jaw right now was the set of a man whose pride was doing his thinking for him. "I just think you should know that people are talking, not kindly, about what it looks like." "What does it look like?" Silas said. Both Evelyn and Tom looked at him. He'd spoken without heat, without the edge that might have escalated things. Just the question, quiet and flat, from a man who'd like an answer. Tom regarded him for a moment. "I don't have a quarrel with you." "I didn't suggest you did. I asked what it looks like since you brought it up." A beat. Tom's jaw worked. A woman in a business taking up with a man people don't know could affect her reputation, her customer's confidence. "Her customer's confidence," Silas repeated, like he was examining the phrase from all angles. "In the best organized and best stocked supply operation in 3 counties, which she's built and maintained alone for 6 years. He paused. "You're saying her customers might lose confidence in that because of who she spends her personal time with?" Tom looked between the two of them. He was clearly recalculating, finding the situation less advantageous than he'd expected, and there was a part of him, a small, decent part, that was already aware that he'd walked into this wrong. "I'm saying the town talks," he said, quieter. "It does," Evelyn said. "It's been talking about me since I was 22. I've been running my business fine throughout. Was there something you needed to buy today, Tom?" He bought a coil of rope he probably didn't need and left with the stiff dignity of a man who would spend the ride home rewriting the conversation in his mind until it came out better for him. The bell rang. Evelyn let out a breath through her nose. Very controlled. She went back to the patent medicine shelf. "You handled that well," Silas said. "I've had practice." She set a bottle of liver tonic in its place. "He's not a bad man. He just has a very clear idea of how things should be arranged, and I don't fit the arrangement." "I know the type." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Does it concern you? What he said about the town talking?" He met her eyes. "People talked about you long before I arrived, and you ran your business fine. Why would this be different?" "It wouldn't." She turned back to the shelf. "I just wanted to know if it concerned you." "What concerns me," he said, "is whether it concerns you." She thought about that for a moment, picked up the next bottle. "Not anymore," she said. "Not the way it used to." That was the truth, and it surprised her a little when she heard herself say it. But it was accurate. The town's opinion of her had been a weight she'd carried so long she'd stopped noticing how heavy it was until she'd started, incrementally, almost without realizing, setting it down. What had happened on the ridge? What had happened with Flint? The way the handwriting in her ledger kept coming out larger. She was taking up more space, and for the first time in years, she wasn't sorry for it. 2 days later, she named the mare Flint to her face, standing at the McCready paddock fence on a Saturday morning when Silas had left the gate open and she'd let herself in. She told the mare her name in a normal voice, without ceremony, and the mare swiveled one ear at her and went back to the patch of frost-dead grass she'd been investigating. "She'll remember," Silas said from behind her. "I know she will." She rode Flint that morning for an hour. Not up the ridge, just around the McCready property, getting to know each other, learning where they each pushed and held back. Flint had opinions. She expressed them. Evelyn had opinions too. She expressed them. They came to an understanding that was less like obedience and more like a negotiation, which suited both of them. At the end of it, brushing Flint down in the paddock, Evelyn felt something she could only describe as right. Not happy. Happiness was too simple a word for it. Rightness was different. Rightness was when the things around you matched the things inside you. "I want to talk to you about something," Silas said. He was leaning against the paddock fence watching her work. "Talk." "I've been looking at a piece of land," he said, "northeast of town, about 40 acres. The Galloway property. Old man Galloway's estate has had it on offer since September. I went out and walked it last week." She kept brushing. "What kind of land?" "Decent grass. A spring that runs year-round, which is the thing. Some timber on the east end. Old house that would need substantial work, but the bones are sound." He paused. "I've saved enough to put a fair offer in. McCready said he'd give me a reference to the estate's representative." She stopped brushing. This was new information. Not surprising. She'd known, since the ridge, that he was thinking about staying. But land was different from intent. Land was a specific and permanent decision. Land was roots. She looked at him over Flint's back. "You're buying property," she said. I'm thinking about buying property." He held her eyes. "I'm telling you before I do anything because I want you to know that it's not impulsive. I've thought about it carefully, and I want to stay. In this county. Near this town. A beat. Near you. I'm not saying that to put pressure on anything. I'm saying it because it's true and you deserve to know the truth of why I'm doing what I'm doing." Evelyn stood with the brush in her hand and looked at Silas Boone across the back of her gray mare, and she thought about the letter she'd written 3 years ago to the Fort Worth Supply Company and then burned. She thought about what Clara had said. This is the real thing beginning. "The Galloway property has a water problem in the east corner," she said. "Drainage issue. Old man Galloway patched it twice and it came back. You'd want to look at it before you finalize anything." Silas was quiet for a moment. "How do you know about the drainage issue?" he said. "Galloway came in for supplies every spring. He complained about that corner every year for 8 years. Specific corner, specific problem." She went back to brushing. "I'll draw you a map of where he said it was. You can walk it before you commit." Another silence. Longer this time. "Evelyn." "I'm not done brushing her." "I know." His voice was different, slightly. "Thank you. It's practical information." "I know that too." She brushed Flint's flank in long, even strokes and kept her face turned away from him for a moment, because there were times when composure required not being looked at. She drew him the map that evening, on a clean piece of paper from the Trading Post ledger sheets, precise and to scale as best she could manage from Galloway's descriptions over 8 years of complaint. She marked the corner, the direction of the grade, the place where he'd said the water pooled after heavy rain. She folded it and gave it to him on Tuesday. He read it standing at the counter, and she watched him read it, and there was something in his face as he looked at the map. Not surprise exactly, but the expression of a man being confirmed in something he already believed. "You keep records of everything," he said. "I keep records of things that might be useful." He looked up from the map. "You made a record of an old man's drainage problem 8 years before you had any reason to use it." "I didn't know I had no reason. I just filed it." She straightened a row of canned goods that didn't need straightening. "That's how things work. You don't know what you'll need until you need it." He folded the map and put it in his coat pocket. "I'm going to walk the property Saturday," he said, "with the map. Let me know what you find." He did. He came back the following Tuesday with dirt on his boots and a particular expression that told her before he spoke. "The drainage is exactly where you said. The patch Galloway put in the second time is already failing. The estate representative is going to want to factor that into any negotiation. They will if they're smart. I'm going to put in an offer." He looked at her steadily. "Below the asking price, with the drainage issue documented as justification. That's reasonable?" "I thought so." He got the property for 11% below asking. He told her 2 weeks later, after the offer was accepted and the papers were signed, standing at the counter on a Thursday morning with snow on his coat shoulders and something settled in his face that she hadn't seen before. "I own land," he said. Not proud exactly. More like a man checking a fact he'd doubted for a long time and finding it true. 40 acres, she said. 42, as it turned out. The survey came back different. She looked at him across the counter. The store was warm and quiet, and outside the first real snow of the season was coming down steady and indifferent. "Congratulations," she said. "It needs a lot of work. I know. The house is going to take spring and most of summer to fix properly." "I know that too." He looked at her. "I'd value your opinion on some of the repairs. If you're willing, you know construction materials, suppliers. I'll help," she said. Simply. Without conditions or negotiations or the careful pre-qualification she applied to everything. Just, "I'll help." His expression did the thing it did. The small shift, the light adjusting. "All right," he said. She gave him back his own word and they both noticed it, and neither of them mentioned it. Christmas came to Dry Creek in the way it came every year, which was with certain social obligations that Evelyn found exhausting and attended anyway out of respect for Clara and for the general principle that community was something you maintained even when you were tired. The church hall event, the small exchange at Clara's, the annual gathering at the Danforth farm that had been happening since before Evelyn was born. She went to all of them. This year Silas was at 2 of them because he'd been invited by McCready and by Clara respectively, and Dry Creek's social anatomy being what it was, the town had now officially processed the information that Evelyn Mercer and the McCready foreman were a thing, which was a word that covered everything and nothing. The reaction was varied. Mabel Cruz was delighted and expressed this through the medium of elaborate and sustained eye contact every time Silas and Evelyn were in the same room. Clara was composed in the way of someone who has been right about something and is exercising restraint about mentioning it. Edwin Gaines, who had apparently warmed to Silas at Clara's dinner, clapped him on the shoulder at the Danforth gathering and told him that the Mercer woman was the best business person in the county, and he was a smart man for recognizing it. That made Evelyn set down her cup of cider and look at the middle distance for a moment, because she was not accustomed to being discussed in those terms by men in a social setting, and the normalcy of it, the way Edwin said it like it was simply obvious, did something to a place in her she hadn't known was still tender. Harold Finch was at the Danforth gathering also. He spent the evening on the opposite end of the room from Evelyn, which suited her completely, and he did not approach her or Silas directly. But she caught him, once, watching them, watching Silas specifically, with an expression that was unreadable but that contained, she thought, some element of recalculation. Like a man updating a ledger entry he'd been confident in. She didn't feel satisfaction about it. She'd thought she might, and she found she didn't. She just felt tired of the whole arithmetic of it and ready for the day when Harold Finch's opinion was so completely irrelevant to her life that she didn't bother tracking it at all. She was almost there. January arrived and was brutal in the way Texas Januaries could be. Not always cold, but deeply unpredictable. A week of bitter freeze followed by 3 warm days that fooled the land, and then another hard drop. Evelyn ran her store, managed her supplies, rode Flint on Saturday mornings at the McCready paddock with increasing confidence and something approaching real pleasure, and spent more time with Silas than she'd spent with another person in years. They went back to the ridge twice more that winter. Once in the middle of January, on one of the warm days when the frost was melting off the brown grass and the light was that particular flat gold of a Texas winter afternoon. Once in February, when it was genuinely cold and they lasted about 15 minutes at the overlook before the wind drove them back down. On the January ride, she told him about her father. She hadn't planned to, but they were on the ridge looking at the valley, and he'd asked, simply, and without the faintly therapeutic quality of someone who thinks a person needs to talk about something, just asked, and she'd found herself talking. Gerald Mercer had been a good man and a poor businessman. He'd loved the store the way you love an idea more than a reality, and he'd been brilliant at the human side of it. He knew everyone, remembered everything personal about his customers, made the trading post a place people came because they liked being there, and terrible at the practical management of it. By the time he died, the debts were layered, the inventory was chaotic, and the accounts were 3 months behind. Evelyn had been 22, and she'd sat in the back office and looked at her father's beautiful, disorganized records and understood, with a clarity that cut through grief, that she would have to build this from the beginning. He was good, she said. He was genuinely good. He was just not made for the mechanics of it. And he never worried about that because he expected I'd marry and there'd be a man to handle it. She paused. He never said that directly, but it was there, in what he didn't say. Did you resent him for it? For a while? She turned the thought carefully. Not anymore. He didn't know he was doing it. That was just how the world worked in his mind, and it never occurred to him to question it. She looked out at the valley. I proved it could work differently. I think he'd have been proud of that, in the end. He'd also have been baffled by me, but he'd have been proud. Silas was quiet for a moment. My father was the opposite, he said. Very clear-eyed about the mechanics, very certain about how things should be done. Zero interest in whether the people around him were good or happy, as long as they were doing the right thing the right way. That sounds hard. It was efficient. A dry note in his voice, not bitter, just accurate. I learned more about work from my father than from anyone else. I also learned that efficiency without warmth is just a machine. He looked at the valley. I've spent 15 years trying to find the balance between those two things. She thought about that. About her father's warmth without mechanics. About her own mechanics that she'd been so careful to keep separate from warmth. Maybe that's what we're doing, she said. Between the two of us. He looked at her. Something moved in his face. Yeah, he said. Maybe it is. February became March. March brought mud and the particular exhausted renewal of early spring, when everything is wet and the land smells of thaw, and there's a quality of beginning in the air that is also a quality of relief. The Galloway house, Silas's house now, was getting its first proper assessment from a carpenter Silas had found in the next town over, and on a warm Saturday in early March, Evelyn went out to see it for the first time. It was a plain 2-story frame house on a slight rise, facing south the way good houses did for the light. It had been empty for 3 years, and it showed. The porch boards were soft, 2 windows were cracked, the kitchen range had a warped door, and the parlor ceiling had a stain from an old roof leak that Silas had already patched. But the bones were sound, as he'd said. The framing was straight. The foundation was solid stone, dry and tight. The rooms were decently proportioned, with good window placement and more storage than she'd expected. She walked through it slowly, the way she walked through her accounts, methodically, making notes in her head. Kitchen needs a new range entirely, she said. The one in there isn't worth repairing. I can source one from the St. Louis catalog at a good price if you order before April. I was thinking the same. The porch boards need to come up and be relaid, not patched, relaid. The problem is the grate underneath, it's holding water. She stood in the parlor and looked up at the repaired ceiling. The plaster's going to need to come down in here and be redone properly. Also on my list. She looked at him. He was watching her move through the house with a particular expression. Not nervous, not eager to please. Just attentive. Taking what she said and filing it accurately, treating it the way he treated everything she said, like information from a reliable source. She went into the second room on the upper floor, which was smaller, with a window looking east toward where the timber started on the property line. Good morning light. Quiet. She stood in that room for a moment. She was aware, with the particular awareness of a person who is honest with themselves even when it's uncomfortable, of what she was doing. She was walking through a house that belonged to a man she was— the word had stopped being something she had to talk herself toward— in love with, and she was evaluating it with the part of her mind that had spent 28 years planning ahead. And the part of her mind that was doing the planning was not just planning for a visit. She looked out the east window. Behind her, Silas came into the room. She heard him stop in the doorway. Evelyn, he said. Yes. I need to say something. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway with the afternoon light coming in behind him and his hat in his hands, and the expression on his face was not the measured, contained expression she was used to seeing there. It was more open than that, more unguarded. It looked, for the first time she could remember seeing it, like a face that had stopped being careful. I know we haven't said the formal things, he said. I know we've been moving carefully, and I think that's been right because you needed that, and honestly, so did I. He was working through it, not rehearsed, she could hear him thinking. But I'm not a man who's good at letting important things go unsaid indefinitely. It starts to feel like a dishonesty I'm not comfortable with. She waited. I love you, he said. I think I have since somewhere around the third Thursday. That's not a pressure. That's not a demand. It's just the truth. And you've always wanted the truth plainly, so there it is. The room was very quiet. Outside, a bird somewhere on the property was doing something loud and persistent that she would have found distracting any other time. I know, she said. He looked at her. She stopped, organized it, tried again, because she was not a woman who let the mechanics fail her when they mattered. I know because I feel it too. I've been saying all right to you since November, and every time I said it, I meant more than the words. She looked at him directly. I love you. I'm not comfortable with that being unsaid anymore either. He crossed the room. He put his hands on either side of her face, careful, present, certain. And he looked at her at close range, eye level, because they were close enough in height that it worked that way. And nobody had ever looked at her at exactly eye level with exactly this expression. Don't shrink yourself for anyone, he said. Not for me, not for this town, not for anything. I know, she said. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway. She put her hand over one of his. The bird outside was still going. They stood in the east room of a house that needed substantial work, in the impractical light of a March afternoon, and it was not smooth or cinematic. Her nose was cold. He had sawdust on his sleeve from the porch inspection earlier. Somewhere below them, the carpenter was moving around making purposeful sounds. She kissed him first, which surprised her, and then didn't because it was accurate. He kissed her back with the same quality of attention he gave to everything, fully present, unhurried, treating it like it mattered, because it did. Downstairs, the carpenter's sounds went tactfully quiet for a while. The bird outside the east window did not. She rode home on Flint that afternoon. The mare was stabled at McCready's and she'd ridden over, which was a thing she now did, which was still sometimes remarkable to her. And the spring air was cool and the fields were muddy and the sky was doing the particular Texas thing of being enormous and pale blue and endless. She rode straight-backed and easy and let Flint pick her footing through the soft ground without micromanaging her, which was something she'd learned over the winter. Some things you had to guide. Some things you could trust. She came into Dry Creek from the North Road and past the end of Main Street, and two women she knew from the Sunday gathering saw her from in front of the seamstress shop and waved, and she raised her hand and waved back, and one of them said something to the other with a smile that Evelyn could see from 30 yards away. She didn't know what they were saying. For the first time in 6 years, she found that she didn't particularly need to. She stabled Flint at the McCready paddock and walked back to the trading post and unlocked the back door and went into her store in the late afternoon light, and the familiar smell of it, cedar and dried tobacco and the particular metallic note of the land stored between the shelves, wrapped around her the way it always had. She got out her ledger. She opened it to the current page. Her handwriting looked different. It had been looking different for months, larger, more settled on the page, less like a woman rationing herself to the minimum space required. But today it looked different in a new way that she examined for a moment before she understood. It looked like someone who was not afraid. She picked up her pen. She started the evening accounts. Behind her, through the window, the last of the March light was going golden over Main Street, and somewhere up the road toward the north, 42 acres of imperfect land was sitting in the thaw, and the bones of a house were standing straight, and the east room had a window that let in the morning light clean and clear. She wrote the numbers in even columns. She didn't once lose track of them. Spring moved through Dry Creek the way it always did, loud and muddy and completely indifferent to human plans. The roads turned to soft clay for 3 weeks in April, which complicated every supply run and made Evelyn's life measurably harder, and the creek came up 2 feet above its winter line and stayed there. And half the county was either repairing something the thaw had broken or waiting for the ground to firm up enough to start. Silas was at the Galloway house, his house, though she noticed he still sometimes said the Galloway place out of habit, like the ownership hadn't fully settled into his vocabulary yet. Every day that McCready could spare him, which in the spring push wasn't always many. He worked the repairs in the order she'd helped him prioritize, roof and drainage first, because those were the things that would cost more if left. Kitchen range, second, porch third. The parlor plaster he left for later because it was the most disruptive and the house was livable without it. She went out on Saturdays. Not every Saturday. She had a business to run and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise, but most of them. She brought supplies from the store at cost, which he tried to pay full price for and she wouldn't allow, and they argued about it twice with the particular texture of an argument between two stubborn people who respect each other too much to be actually angry, and eventually they arrived at a compromise she tracked in a private ledger column. She labeled simply Boone account and that she had no particular plan for, but that felt right to maintain. She helped where she knew how and stayed out of the way where she didn't. She wasn't a carpenter and she didn't pretend to be one, but she knew materials, she knew suppliers, she knew which hardware store in which town had the best price on which item, and she knew how to read a project's needs ahead of time well enough that things arrived before they were needed rather than after. The carpenter, a quiet, methodical man named Aldous Webb from the next county, told Silas after the third Saturday that the Mercer woman thought like a project foreman. Silas told her. She filed it away in the private place where she kept the things that mattered. It was a Thursday in late April when Silas came into the store and didn't go to the stove and didn't reach for his mug. He stood at the counter with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that was not nervous, because nervous wasn't quite the right word for him, but particular, concentrated, like a man who has organized something carefully in his mind and is about to lay it out. Evelyn set down her pen. She waited. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You can ask me anything." "I know." A beat. "The house will be livable by July. Not finished, there's always more to do, but livable." He looked at her steadily. "I'd like it to be livable for both of us." The store was very quiet. Outside on Main Street a wagon went past, wheels loud on the thawing road. She looked at him across the counter her father had built, the counter she'd stood behind for 6 years making change and filling orders and telling herself that the practical life was enough, that she had everything she needed, that the wanting of anything more specific was a vulnerability she couldn't afford. "That's not exactly a question," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not quite relief, but the territory adjacent to it. "No," he said. "I suppose it isn't." He put one hand flat on the counter. "Evelyn, will you marry me? That's the question." She had thought sometimes about what she would feel if someone she actually wanted said those words to her. She'd thought about it in the abstract, the way you think about things you've trained yourself not to expect. She'd assumed it would be complicated, tangled up with the old wariness, the long defensive habits, the careful interior accounting she'd done for years to make the lonely math come out acceptable. It wasn't complicated. It was clear. Clean as the number at the bottom of a column that adds up right. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. One quiet breath, controlled, but she heard what was in it. "The East Room," she said. He looked at her. What about it? When I walked through the house in March, the east room with the window. She held his eyes. I stood there and I knew I was thinking about more than a visit. I want you to know that. I was already there before you said anything. He came around the counter. She stayed where she was and let him come, and he put his hands on her face the way he had in the east room in March, at eye level, and he looked at her the way he always had, straight on, without the slightly sideways quality that most people used, like she was too much to look at directly. No shrinking, he said. No shrinking, she said back. Not a promise. A statement of fact. The kind she was good at. He kissed her in the middle of the trading post at 2 p.m. on a Thursday, and the bell above the door rang because a customer came in and stopped immediately and said, "Oh, beg pardon," and left again, and neither of them particularly cared. Clara found out within 24 hours. Evelyn suspected Mabel Cruz, who had almost certainly witnessed the customer's hasty retreat and drawn accurate conclusions. Clara came in on Friday morning before the store was properly open, knocked once, and stood in the doorway with her coat still on and looked at Evelyn with the expression of a woman who has been right about something for 6 months and is now receiving her due. "Well," she said. "Yes," Evelyn said. Clara sat down on the stool behind the counter, her stool, by long custom, and was quiet for a moment in a way that was unusual for her. "Your mother would have been relieved," she said finally, "but she'd have pretended to be simply happy. I'm simply happy, and I won't pretend otherwise." Evelyn looked at her. Clara had known her mother, had known this family for longer than Evelyn had been alive. There were times when that fact was simply a background detail and times when it arrived with weight. This was the second kind. "Thank you, Clara," she said, meaning it fully. "Don't thank me. I told you what I saw. You're the one who let it become something." Clara straightened up. "When?" "Summer. July, probably, after the house is livable." "Where?" "Here. Dry Creek." She picked up her pen. "Small. Just the people who matter." "That's wise." Clara stood. "Though I'll tell you now, this town will make it larger than you plan. People want to witness things they were wrong about." She was right about that. The news moved through Dry Creek with the speed that significant news always moved through a small town, which was to say it had lapped the community twice before Evelyn had told anyone herself. By Saturday, she'd received 7 separate congratulations from people she encountered in the normal course of her day, ranging from Edwin Gaines's warm handshake to Mabel Cruz's barely contained delight to a formal and slightly awkward acknowledgement from Tom Acker, who came in for actual supplies this time and managed, with visible effort, to say that he hoped she'd be very happy, and meant it, she thought, as much as a man can mean something that requires him to revise himself. Harold Finch said nothing to her directly, but she heard, from Roy Acker, who had the consistent and sometimes inconvenient habit of reporting things accurately, that Harold had said in the feed store that he supposed Boone was a decent enough fellow, even if he'd always thought Evelyn Mercer would have been better off keeping to her store. Evelyn heard this and felt nothing in particular, which was its own kind of answer. The distance between the Harold Finch of October and the Harold Finch of April measured not in miles but in how much space he took up in her interior life. He'd gone from something that could hollow her out to something she could hear about secondhand and forget by noon. That was what healing looked like, she thought. Not the dramatic reversal, not the triumphant moment, just the slow, incremental reduction of old wounds to old scars, until one day you realize the thing that used to bleed doesn't even ache. The house was livable by the 3rd week of June, which was 2 weeks later than Silas had planned, because the plaster in the parlor turned out to require more work than Aldous Webb's initial estimate, and the kitchen range flue needed to be relined before it was safe to use, and Silas was not a man who would call a thing finished when it wasn't finished. Evelyn respected that. She had the same quality, applied to accounts. Close enough was not the same as right, and they both knew the difference. She came out the day Aldous finished the last of the parlor plaster and stood in the middle of the room and looked up at the ceiling, which was smooth and white and solid. And then she walked to the east room upstairs and stood at the window. The morning light came in clean, the way she'd known it would. Silas came up behind her and stood in the doorway. "Well," he said. "It's right," she said. He came in and stood beside her at the window. Below them, the 42 acres went out toward the timber, green now with early summer, and the spring ran silver through the low ground on the east side, which was no longer the drainage problem it had been, because Silas had spent 3 days of the April mud season addressing it properly from the source. "I want to say something," she said. "Say it." She kept her eyes on the east fields. "I've been thinking about what we talked about on the ridge, in January, about your father's efficiency, and my father's warmth and what we're doing between the two of us." She paused, organizing it. "I think what I wanted to say is that I've been keeping those things separate my whole life. Competence on one side, warmth on the other, and a line between them that I thought I needed to protect." She turned to look at him. "I don't think I need the line anymore." He looked at her for a moment. "What changed?" "You," she said, simply. "You treated them like they could be the same thing. You treated the way I run my accounts and the way I love you like they came from the same place." She paused. "They do. I just couldn't see it until someone else could." He didn't answer immediately. He had the quality she'd come to rely on, the quality of sitting with a true thing before responding, rather than rushing past it. "You would have gotten there," he said finally. "You were already getting there." "Maybe." She turned back to the window. "But it helps to have someone standing next to you when you do." They were married on the second Saturday of July, in the yard of Clara Holt's house, because Clara had offered, and because the yard was larger than the trading post and had the benefit of being Clara's, which meant the arrangements would be managed with the efficiency of a military operation and the warmth of someone who had been waiting 6 months to do exactly this. The ceremony was small, in the sense that Evelyn had intended small. In practice, it was attended by 41 people, because small in Dry Creek was a relative concept, and because, as Clara had predicted, people wanted to witness the thing they'd been wrong about. Edwin Gaines came. Rose and Henry Danforth came. Judith Warren, the schoolteacher, came and brought 2 of her students' families because they were neighbors, and it seemed rude to exclude them. Charlie Wren, who had covered the trading post for Evelyn on more mornings than she could count, came and brought his wife and stood in the back with the expression of a man quietly pleased about something he'd observed from a front row seat. Mabel Cruz came and cried within the first 3 minutes, and made no apologies for it. Clara stood at the front and watched the whole proceeding with her hands folded and her face composed in the particular way that meant she was feeling a great deal, and had decided that this was not the venue to display it. Silas wore his clean coat, which was the best coat he owned, and he stood at the front of the gathered people and watched Evelyn walk across Clara's yard toward him, in her good dress, dark blue, the one she wore for nothing else. And his face was so open and unguarded that Mabel Cruz, watching from the side, started crying again before anything had been said. The justice of the peace kept the words brief, which was what they'd asked for. Evelyn had written what she wanted to say, which was, "I am not easy, and you know that, and you chose it anyway. I'll spend the rest of my life being worth that choice." She said it clearly, without the wobble she'd been mildly worried about, because she'd had years of practice saying true things plainly, and this was the truest thing she'd ever said. Silas said, "You don't have to earn anything from me. You never did. But I'll stand next to you while you keep doing it anyway, because that's who you are, and it's why I'm here." Mabel Cruz was effectively useless for the next several minutes. Harold Finch was not there. Evelyn had not invited him and had not expected him and did not think about him on her wedding day, which was perhaps the fullest expression of how far she had come from October. The summer that followed was the working kind, the kind that 2 capable people make together when they have a business and a property, and the particular organized energy of people who know how to use their time. Evelyn ran the trading post. Silas ran the McCready operation through the summer push, and with McCready's blessing and a salary adjustment that Evelyn had quietly advised him to negotiate for, took on management of 3 additional accounts in the county that needed a foreman's oversight on a part-time basis. She expanded the trading post's hardware line again that summer, into a territory she'd been considering for 2 years, proper building supplies, priced for the county's current growth rate, which she'd been tracking and her suppliers hadn't noticed yet. She was right about the timing. By September, she'd had to reorder twice and was negotiating a standing contract that would give her a price advantage going into the following year. Silas read the contract proposal before she sent it and made 2 suggestions, one of which she incorporated and one of which she explained was unnecessary given the specific supplier relationship, and he said, "You're right," without qualification, and she incorporated the first suggestion and sent the contract. They were, in the accounting of things, Good partners. Not perfect. She found him frustrating sometimes. He had a tendency to make decisions about the property without telling her until after, which she addressed directly twice before he corrected it. He found her frustrating sometimes too, though it took her longer to get this out of him. She was so competent that asking her for help felt to him, occasionally, like admitting failure. She told him that was the most self-defeating piece of thinking she'd heard since Tom Acker had explained what he was looking for in a wife. And he laughed. Genuinely. Fully. And she counted that laugh as one of the better moments of her first year of marriage. They argued. Not constantly, not dramatically, but with the real friction of two strong-willed people sharing a life. And they'd learned quickly that the arguments that mattered were the ones worth having clearly and resolving specifically, and the arguments that didn't matter were the ones to let go of before the end of the day. They got better at telling the two kinds apart as the months went on. They weren't there yet, but they were getting there. The East Room became her study, her accounts, her contract files, the careful, meticulous records she'd been keeping since her father died. She brought them from the Trading Post's back office and organized them in the room with the east window and the morning light. And she worked there on Sunday mornings while Silas did the property rounds. And it was the kind of private space she'd never had before, and she loved it with the fierce, specific love of a woman who'd earned every square foot. She rode Flint every Saturday morning. This did not change. It had been true since November, and it remained true through the winter and into the second spring, and the mare had become, in the way that animals become things over time, a fact of Evelyn's life as settled and necessary as her accounts. Flint had opinions about routes, about pace, about the specific injustice of being asked to move through mud above a certain depth. Evelyn had opinions back. They understood each other. The Saturday rides became a thing the town knew about. Evelyn Mercer, Evelyn Boone. Now, though, she kept Mercer on the Trading Post sign because the Trading Post was Gerald Mercer's legacy, and she wasn't going to paint his name out, coming up Main Street on the gray mare in the early morning, before most of the town was properly awake. Straight-backed, easy in the saddle, moving north toward the Ridge Trail or east toward the Boone property, depending on the morning. People stopped noticing it as a thing to remark on. That was the change she valued most. Not the wedding, not the house, not the expansion of the business, though all of those mattered. But the morning when she rode past the end of Main Street and saw two women she knew talking outside the seamstress shop, and they waved and she waved, and they went back to their conversation without a pause, without the sidelong look, without the slight recalibration that used to happen when people saw her doing something they hadn't assigned her permission to do. She was just a woman on a horse on a Saturday morning. That was all. That was everything. Clara came to the Trading Post on a Tuesday in October, the second October since the first one, the year since Harold Finch had stood at the counter and said what he'd said, and sat on her stool and looked at Evelyn with the particular attentiveness of a woman taking stock. "You look different," Clara said. "I'm a year older." "Not that kind of different." Clara folded her hands. "The kind that takes up more room." Evelyn looked up from her accounts. "Is that a complaint?" "It's an observation, and no." Clara picked up the almanac from the corner shelf, a reflex from visiting here for years, and held it without opening it. "The Harrington girl came to me last week. 17, works at the mill. Her family's been telling her she's too forthright for any decent man to want her." Evelyn was quiet. "I told her to come talk to you," Clara said. Something moved through Evelyn. Not surprise, not quite. More like recognition, like a shape she'd seen before from the inside and was now being shown from the outside. "Send her on a Tuesday," she said. "Tuesdays are slower." Clara nodded, set the almanac down. "That's all I wanted to say." She left. The Harrington girl came the following Tuesday. Her name was May. She had the particular rigid posture of someone braced for a dismissal, and she came in the door with the slightly defiant expression of a person who has been told so many limiting things that she started wearing the limitations like armor. Evelyn set aside what she was doing. She didn't give May a speech. She didn't tell her story from the beginning. She asked May what she was good at, and then listened to the answer. Really listened, the way she'd always wanted to be listened to. And then she told May one thing, which was, "The problem is never that you're too much. The problem is that some people aren't enough, and it's not your job to get smaller to fix that." May looked at her for a long moment. "How do you know?" she said. Not skeptically, genuinely. looking for the source. Because I spent 28 years being told I was too much, Evelyn said. And then someone came along who was enough. And the difference was everything. May went away quieter than she'd arrived, not transformed. Transformation was a slower, harder thing than a single conversation, and Evelyn knew that better than most. But quieter in the way of someone who has been given a piece of information they're going to need eventually and have stored it somewhere they can find it. Silas was at the counter when May left. He'd come in from the property on an errand and had been standing near the stove, not interrupting. He looked at Evelyn across the store. "Clara's matchmaking again," he said. "Different kind of matchmaking." He thought about that. "Good kind." "I think so." He came to the counter, picked up the small piece of hardware he'd actually come for, a specific bolt she'd ordered for the barn repair, and turned it over in his hand. "I've been thinking about the south pasture," he said. "The drainage there's better than I thought. I think we could run more cattle in spring than the previous estimate." She reached under the counter for the county land survey she kept there. She'd started keeping it there in March, which told its own story about how their lives had integrated. She opened it to the relevant section. "Show me," she said. He leaned over this counter and pointed out the section, and she looked at the survey and at the numbers in her head and said, the creek access in the southwest corner would be the limiting factor before the pasture acreage. And he said, "I walked that corner last week. The access is better than the survey shows." And she said, "Then you'd want to walk it again after the first rain to see how it holds." And he said, "That's exactly what I was thinking." They stood on either side of the trading post counter, bent over a land survey talking about cattle access and creek drainage, and it was as unromantic as it sounds and as utterly, completely theirs as anything either of them had ever owned. Outside, Main Street was doing what Main Street did. The ordinary percussion of a small town's Tuesday morning. Wagon wheels and voices, and a dog that had strong feelings about something on the north end of the block. In 2 months, it would be November. A year since the first Thursday. A year since a man walked in with an organized supply list and noticed the storeroom shelving system and said smart like it was simply a fact. Evelyn looked at the survey and listened to Silas talk about the south pasture and felt the particular quality of a life that was fully, specifically, unapologetically hers. Not the life she'd accepted in the absence of anything better. Not the life she'd built to survive the absence of anything else. The life she'd nearly talked herself out of believing in, that had arrived anyway, stubbornly, through a trading post door on an October morning with a folded supply list in its coat pocket. She had not made herself smaller for it. She had not softened her edges or quieted her opinions or pretended her competence was something to apologize for. She had stood at her counter being exactly what she was, and that had been, not in spite of itself but because of itself, enough. More than enough. The county didn't know it yet, but Evelyn Mercer was already quietly becoming the person that younger women in Dry Creek pointed to when they needed proof that the story they'd been told about themselves wasn't the only story available. It happened without announcement, without speeches or deliberate example setting. It happened the way real change happens, slowly, person by person, conversation by conversation, one Tuesday at a time. May Harrington came back 3 weeks later. Not for advice, she came in for supplies, a legitimate errand. But she held herself differently, marginally. The rigid braced posture had relaxed by approximately 20%, which Evelyn noticed and filed away and did not comment on. Some things you noted without saying. She'd learned that from Silas. He came to pick her up at 4 o'clock. She'd started closing at 4 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, a modification to 6 years of habit that she'd made without drama. And he stood outside on the street holding both horses, Flint and the Chestnut, and she came out and locked the door and stood for a moment on the step. The October light was the same hard gold it had been a year ago. The air had the same early chill, the sign above her, Mercer's Supply. Est. 1861, cast the same shadow it always did at this hour. A year ago she'd locked this door alone and walked home alone and told herself that the practical life was sufficient, and she'd believed it, and she'd been wrong. She came down the step and took Flint's reins and looked at Silas. "South pasture?" she said. "I thought we could ride the creek line before the light goes." "Good." She swung up into the saddle, straight-backed, easy, correct. Silas mounted the Chestnut. They rode north on the road out of Dry Creek, side by side, at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow. The pace of two people who know where they're going and aren't worried about arriving because the going itself is something they've decided to value. The road curved past the edge of town and opened onto the county road, and beyond it the Boone property fence line began, and beyond that the south pasture in its autumn brown, and beyond that the timber going amber and rust at the tree line, and beyond that the sky, the same enormous Texas sky, pale blue and endless, that had been there the whole time, through all of it. Evelyn rode. She did not take up less space than she required. She did not arrive any smaller than she left. And the town of Dry Creek, going about its October Tuesday behind her, barely looked up from its own business, which was, in the end, exactly as it should be.